But I'm glad to have this opportunity now to look together at some of God's reminders for us. And I'm going to say we're going to remind ourselves by looking at some of God's reminders for us from the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy chapter 8. If you'd like to make your way over there to Deuteronomy 8 is where we're going to be for most of our discussion this evening. But how's your memory? How's your memory? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you've got a great one or a bad one. We may be singing again. I'm not sure what you're seeing. I saw a song there for a second. I'm not going to lead the song. But I do. We just mentioned Ra, and I've stolen this quote from him, that I've got a great memory. It's just not very long. It's about that short. Some of you might can associate with that. Now, my all-time favorite memory story. Now, I got in trouble this morning. Somebody told me, you can't get by with dad jokes unless it's the Father's Day sermon. You can't do a dad joke and a Mother's Day sermon. Well, here's, I think, my all-time favorite story/joke about memory. It's the older couple that are sitting on a bench, and the two men start discussing their memories. And the one man begins to tell of how they got he and his wife, this new medication that is supposed to help. They haven't been taking it very long, so I don't know yet, but it's supposed to help with memory. Well, what's it called? I don't remember. Okay, there's a joke there, right? And then he goes, what's that really pretty flower? That popular flower, it usually is red in color. It's got thorns. What's that flower? What is it? She's not allowed to answer. Yeah. He goes, hey, yeah, Rose. Rose, what was the name of that medication? His wife's name is Rose, just so everybody got that, okay? But the power of memory, it is truly amazing, isn't it? That God has given our brains the ability to experience things, to read things, to hear things. We tend to focus visually, right, on things that we've seen and experienced that we hold on to. But that ability to hold something that has happened in the past and to relive it, as it were, possibly hundreds, if not thousands of times later in life. And sometimes it's a curse, right? And sometimes it's that we can't seem to forget the things we wish we could, and then the things we'd really like to remember, we tend to forget. There's the curse of bad memories, but then there's the blessing, the comforts, sometimes the excitement of thinking about the good memories you have of a person, perhaps a person that's no longer here, or of an occasion, of an event. It might be a time when you traveled somewhere. It might be something that happened in your living room. But there's something about memory. But what happens as the people of God when we don't remember God? When we don't remember to acknowledge Him in the way that we live? When we tend to intentionally forget? That's possible. The Bible talks about willful ignorance, by pushing God to the peripheral of our lives, and in that way we forget about God. You might call it this evening spiritual amnesia. It's as if Satan conked us over the head. Now, that's not how it works, but you could think about it that way in somewhat of a fun metaphor. That spiritually speaking, it is a dangerous thing to be forgetful. Now, yes, to be clear, we're not talking about actual forgetfulness in the sense of we're losing our memory or we're having issues with it. We're talking about that more spiritual aspect of a failure to focus and intentionally acknowledge or remember God in our hearts and thus in our lives. So from Deuteronomy 8 this evening, let's remind ourselves of these three. And the first one is a remembrance itself. To remember God's discipline and provision. And those are put together because the text does that. That God disciplines, and yet even in His discipline, He is providing for us. And then to realize His blessings. And the first one is more when we're in the wilderness, we're in the valley moments of life. To remember even in those moments that God can use that to help us and that He's still caring for us. But then almost on the other side, once we make it out of the valley, we're on the mountaintop, to make sure we stop and realize His blessings on the mountain. And then the danger is to make sure that we resist the danger, that we resist the dangers of pride and spiritual, let's insert that here, forgetfulness. From Deuteronomy 8, first, and this is from the first part of the passage, remembering God's discipline and provision. It's like sandpaper. You ever taken a piece of wood, might have been furniture, and you've got to smooth out the rough spots. And it's wonderful what just a little sandpaper work can do. And sometimes you have to use a heavier grit, and then you work your way down to a lower grit, or higher grit technically in number, you know what I mean, a smoother, less coarse sandpaper. But when you're done, whether it's you're sanding wood or you're sanding something that's been primed and painted, it's one of those times you kind of feel like there's nothing like that. There's no other feeling than being able to touch the finished product and see how nice and smooth everything is. As humans, we've got some rough spots. And it takes some roughness, some sandpaper-like work in our hearts to smooth out the rough spots. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, the first 5 verses, Moses is in the middle of his second discourse in Deuteronomy. He's just reminded them in chapter 7 of God's immense love for them. That it wasn't because there was anything special about them, it was because there's something special about God. That they were chosen and that they have the privilege of being His children now, His firstborn son as a whole entity of people. And now they're in that transition phase. They've marched 4 decades through the wilderness. They're at the point of entry, and Moses is about to give leadership to Joshua, and they will enter the land, eventually cross the Jordan, and conquer the land. And as Moses gives them reminders of their past, but really at this point in Deuteronomy, it's more about the present and looking to the future. He's kind of moved on from reviewing their history and the laws that had been given to exposing the law more and giving them some insight into here's what's going to happen. Here's what you need to be ready for in Deuteronomy chapter 8. You need to be ready to enter the land. But he has one more reminder for them. It's that when they were in the wilderness, God humbled them. It's about dependence. Now, there's more than one correct answer to why the wilderness experience. Why was it 40 years? Part of the answer to that is because they complained and rebelled and said they couldn't take it. Remember that? That's why. That's the one reason back in Numbers why they were in the wilderness for 40 years. But another answer here in Deuteronomy 8, why did God have them go through the wilderness experience at all? Even that first generation. It was to humble them, to put them to the test, not because God didn't know, but because they didn't know in a sense. God was testing them, or even the word proving them could be used. And the first generation failed the test. The second generation so far has been tested or proved, ready to enter the land. For example, if you go back, now we're going to read Deuteronomy 8, I promise. But if you go back to Exodus 16, when God first gives them the bread, the manna, what is it? He tells Moses, I'm doing this as a test. So both their hunger, that he let them get hungry, was a kind of test. But even when he fed them, that was a kind of test. Are you going to keep depending on me? Are you going to gather more than one day's share each day, except for before the Sabbath? Remember that? If you gathered more than one day, it didn't work out too well. Seems like I remember Jesus saying something in a prayer about give us this day our daily bread. A few centuries later, daily dependence on God. I don't know how much we get that in our culture, because most of us, we've got pantries with lots of food. We've got refrigerators full of things we're keeping cold, and we've got grocery store upon grocery store. And I know sometimes we think we're kind of isolated. We don't have a lot of shopping options, but I remember living in a town that didn't have a Walmart. I mean, can you really imagine that? I know some of you can. Look at what God says to them. Let's read Deuteronomy 8 now. The first part, the first verse is, you might see it as the overall idea, not just here, but throughout Deuteronomy, is you need to make sure you do what God says and do all of it, or the whole of it. That's verse 1, isn't it? He says, the whole commandment that I command you today, you should be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And now verse 2, first time he says, you shall remember. There's about 8 specific times in the 8th chapter of Deuteronomy where he either says remember or don't forget. That's one of the most remember/forget filled passages in the whole Bible. There's only about 5 other times in Deuteronomy where you have the warning about not forgetting something about God. But he says here, you shall remember the whole way, that whole way you were in the wilderness, that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. You might also hear an echo there. When Jesus is tempted in Matthew 4, also recorded in Luke 4, each time he answers Satan's ploys from Deuteronomy. Ever thought about that one? Now, Jesus, from one standpoint, is the one who gave Deuteronomy to Moses. But it also makes me think that Jesus, from even the human standpoint, he kind of knew Deuteronomy. He quotes all 3 times. And the first time is from Deuteronomy 8, verse 3. Man does not live by bread alone, by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. As you bring this back to us, is it possible that there are times when God, in his wisdom and in his sovereignty, sometimes some of this, obviously God was more directly causing, like the wilderness experience, but sometimes lets us get to low points in life, lets us get hungry. It might be for actual bread, it might be for something else. So that we learn, we come to humility because of it. Now, sometimes we let our problems make us bitter, and our discouragements just keep leading downward in a spiral. But sometimes we hit rock bottom, and as the proverbial saying is, the only way to go is what? Is up, and we look up to God. But sometimes God uses the wilderness experiences of life, our losses and our failures and our disappointments, to teach us to depend on him. So he let them get hungry, and then he fed them one day share. So they didn't know where tomorrow's meal was coming from other than God giving it to them. Now, our experience is less extreme than that, right? We don't see the cloud and the fiery pillar. We don't have manna falling down from heaven. But should our dependence on God be any less? Now, it's also about sonship. It's also about sonship. Look at verse 5. We'll read verse 4, where we're reminded that even in all this, he did feed them, and he protected them. He kept their feet from swelling, or it may be something more along the lines of he kept their feet from being bruised. He kept their sandals from breaking and ripping apart so they weren't walking barefoot across the Sinai Peninsula in the wilderness for 4 decades. And how much of this is miraculous? How much of this is God working through natural provision? They did have lots of flocks with them. Think about that. We're not really told. We're just told that God made sure they had everything they needed. There's a couple of times elsewhere in Deuteronomy we're told they lacked nothing. Chapter 2, verse 7 is one of those if you like to look at it. But verse 4 here in Deuteronomy 8 says, your clothing did not wear out, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Know then that in your heart, as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. Our discipline that even we experience, and whether that's God using a down moment in life, whether it is the Word of God that pricks our hearts, it is a father's love for his children. You think about your own children, and it's possible to raise children to where you try and keep them from never having any disappointments, never suffering consequences for misbehavior, never having the responsibility to potentially fail and suffer consequences. Sometimes parents try to almost overprotect in that sense, and it's one of the worst things you can do. God's the kind of father who allows his children sometimes to get hungry so they know where they're fed because he loves them. Now, if you were to drop down to verse 16, I included that here because he says there, he reminds them in that later passage, he fed you, he humbled you for your good. God's goal wasn't to hurt them, wasn't for them to suffer and just be hungry because he's a cruel tyrant or something. It was a father who chastens or who trains and disciplines. That word kind of means both there. For their good, for our good. In Deuteronomy 8, verse 16. You might have heard this before, that God never really commands anything of us that isn't for our best. It doesn't always feel like it. It doesn't always look like it. It may take some time because he is a big picture God. But it's for our good. It's for his glory. It's also for our good. And then you might incorporate Hebrews 12 into that. He even says, no discipline feels good when it's happening. But eventually, it produces something healthy and great. Remembering God's discipline, and even in that discipline, he's still providing for his children. He's providing the discipline, but even more than that. Think through how this worked here with he provided the manna, he provided for their safety, and even things like clothing and footwear. But here's the second one. As we read the rest of this paragraph together, we're going to move now to verses 6 through 10. But imagine this evening, you are born to homeless parents. All they've ever known is homelessness, at least while you were growing up, and for sure then all you've ever known is you don't know for sure where you're going to be living tomorrow. You don't know for sure where your next meal's coming from. What would that be like? What would it be like if then all of a sudden, and whether it's however it worked out, the details aside, your parents tell you, we've got an apartment. Or if you really want to make this more parallel, we have a mansion with 100 acres of beautiful pasture. It's got a bass pond. I mean, you can really make this big. How would that feel? So to make it more specific here, what if your parents had only known slavery? And you had only known either growing up as a slave to parents that were slaves at least, and being a nomad, wandering around the wilderness for 40 years. Because that's where these people are. These people have never known any kind of security. Most of these have never really known anything except the nomadic lifestyle, living in tents. And Moses says God's going to give you a land and houses. He's going to give you, if you will, the ancient mansion life. He says he's going to give them the promised land. Now, they have to do something to hold on to it. And I took those three words he uses here, to keep, to walk, and fear, a.k.a. reverence God. But look at it in verse 6. He says, Deuteronomy 8:6, so you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and by fearing him. So you hold his commandments dear in your heart. You live them out in your daily life. And all of that is because you're walking in the fear of God. You're bowing your whole self to God. Because, he then says, for the Lord your God is bringing you, notice the tense there, into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs. So you've got the surface water, the first one, the next two are the underground water. This is a place a lot like western Oklahoma where the rains are very seasonal. And so they depended on irrigation for their crops. They depended on being able to dig down and find the freshwater springs. There are a lot of them recorded in ancient text, other ancient text. There's a lot of them today. And there's a historical credibility here that everything that's said here checks out of this ancient land of Canaan, then and today, for that matter. He goes on, though, flowing out in the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you can dig copper. And those 7 agricultural productions are all also accurate. Olive oil and wine were the 2 biggest exports from the land of Canaan in this day. And then and now, there's quite a bit of iron ore. Now, not all of it is that great. There's a few of it is that's pretty high quality, and copper. They still mine for both of those in Palestine today. That's how Moses paints the picture here. That's what God's going to give you. So what do you do about it? Well, on the front end, I think that's kind of now and then. Verse 6, you keep, you walk, you fear. But what do you do afterwards? And this may be where one tradition arose, that instead of offering your prayer of thanks for your meal before you eat, that you eat and then you give thanks. Look at verse 10. You bless the Lord. And when you read bless there, you might also hear the word praise, or even connecting with our class this morning, the word thanks. Give thanks. Verse 10, and you shall eat and be full. You're going to be satisfied. And you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. It reminds me of later in Deuteronomy 26. And we're not going to go to that passage. You can read it on your own if you'd like. But it's when he says, after you're there and you have your harvest and you reap all of the grain and the blessings, you bring a basket of it and you bring it to the priest and you set it before the Lord. And there you worship with your basket full. That's almost an expanded version of verse 10. You stop and worship God. And here, the timing is after you've eaten of his blessings. You enjoy his blessings, but make sure you don't miss out on that next step of blessing him. Now, there is a slight shift in the form of blessings, and I say slight, because spiritual blessings were a part of this covenant. I don't mean that. But because they were not only a spiritual people, they were also a civic national entity. They were a civil nation. That, as I see, is one of the reasons why a lot of the emphasis in this time is on things like the houses and the crops and things like that. And I know not long ago we talked about the idea of, is prosperity guaranteed today and all that, and we basically said, no, it's not. But the principle here is that whether it is something that you have as a possession, or it's your family and friends, or it is spiritual blessings, which really would be a higher priority on the list of blessings, if God has blessed you, and that if is not really an if, I know he has. He's blessed us. Are we doing this next part? Are we blessing him? And again, that doesn't mean necessarily we give something back to him other than our praise, our appreciation, our adoration, our worship. We realize his blessings, and they are not truly realized until we've done the end of verse 10, until we've blessed the Lord. Realize his blessings. That brings us to this last part. We're going to overview this last part as we conclude. The young, successful Wall Street man stands at the top of his own building, his own skyscraper, reaches out his arms and says, look what I've done. And then looks back at his hands and with my own 2 hands, I've done it. Kind of like a modern day Nebuchadnezzar. And his friend inquires, who made your hand? In this next passage, the second half of Deuteronomy 8, Moses warns the people of God then, God warns the people of God tonight of the danger of what entitlement, complacency, greed can do to our hearts. I put pride first. I actually had forgetfulness first, and then I rethought it because of verse 14. And if you look at verse 14, it starts with your heart being lifted up. That's pride. And then you forget. Pride is so strong. It can corrupt our hearts. Here, it can pervert our own memory to where we forget God. Now, as you start in verse 11, it begins with a failure to obey. You could almost say that forgetfulness here, what that looks like, or what it translates to spiritually, is a failure to obey. Now, it starts with pride, it starts with complacency, it starts with comfort and the passage of time. Things happen, and you get there in the land, and you've been living there a while for them. For us, might be you're a Christian, you've been a Christian a long time, and then it leads to a failure to obey. Verse 11, take care lest you forget. And sometimes that phrase has been borrowed and used on memorials and military honors, lest we forget. Lest you forget the Lord your God. Why? How? By not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today. Because they are going to eat, just like verse 10 says. So really, verse 10 is the positive. Here's how it should go. Now 12 and following is more of how it may go, and there's some prediction here, because most of what Moses says is exactly what happens for the next generation. Because it's also about forgetting the Lord himself then. Look at verse 12. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built houses and live in them, and your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied. By the way, you can read this and put it into the context of our nation. Again, I think that you got to be careful about that, but you can look at it that way. And you can look at what happens to a nation that gets successful and economically productive, and how complacency and comfort can be dangerous. Entitlement, greed. He says in verse 14, though then your heart be lifted up and you forget the Lord your God. Who is this? He goes on to say he's the one who brought you out of slavery in Egypt, the one who led you in the wilderness, provided for your every need. And now, looking to the future here, you would say to them, now you've already been given the land. You've been enjoying the fruits of it. That's the problem. Now, to be clear, the problem is not that God gave them the land. The problem here is how they used what God gave them. The problem is not when God blesses us today, whether spiritually, physically, both. The problem is that sometimes we allow the blessing of prosperity and ease and peace to twist our hearts so that we forget God. What happens to the people of God when they forget their God? And then they start focusing inwardly. They start looking back at self. They start, like the young man, looking at their own hands or looking at idols and fake gods. Because if you don't acknowledge the true God who gives you everything you have, what other course do you have? You're going to either point to self and focus on yourself and make yourself the God, or you start looking and worshiping things and other people and relationships and money and hobbies or whatever it is that you've been blessed to enjoy by God. Look at verse 16. He says, or verse 17 rather, beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth. Remember, who gave you your hands? It is him you shall remember, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers as it is this day. The reason God gave you this and the power to have this is to keep his promise. That's why you're here. And if you forget the Lord your God, this is that last one there, and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I solemnly warn you today, you shall utterly perish. What is the final outcome of pride in my heart that leads me to forgetting to acknowledge God? It's not pretty. And so he says in verse 20, you'll be like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so shall you perish because you would not obey. You're back to a failure to obey the voice of the Lord your God. The people that God is driving out of this land, he's going to drive you out of this land if you forget God. Could there be something there for us? Don't go into this being a Christian, being blessed and forgiven by Jesus and having every spiritual blessing and somehow think you've got it made. You know, God's my father now. I'm his daughter, his son. We're good. And forget where all the good things come from. And forget to keep intentionally serving and living for God. But we have an ideal in our world, don't we? The ideal that we hold up and idolize. And it's either the young entrepreneur that's successful. You know, they may not even have to go to college. They don't need college. They skip college. And by the way, I'm not arguing one way or the other on that, okay? I'm just thinking about the overall we idolize sometimes is that it's the young entrepreneur who can retire by 30 or 35, 40. You're late by then, right? If you're retiring at 40. And we tend to look down on the people that haven't made it like that are still working the 9-to-5 job. Or it's the Hollywood star or the young athlete that's making millions upon millions. And I like football, okay? That's not the point. The point is about what we hold up as a society, and sometimes as Christians, we get pulled into that, don't we? And here, the warning is be careful. Whether it's something you idolize like that or something you're involved with directly, be careful what that can do to your heart. It can lead you to forget the God of heaven. 3 reminders from our God through Moses and the ancient people of God this evening. To remember God's discipline. Sometimes he's going to allow you he's going to even in a way lead you through some dark valleys in life. Not to hurt you or harm you, but to help you to be humbled and be more dependent on God. They would forget their total dependence on God, and it would take one generation in Judges 2 and 3. Those passages are on your handout. There arose, almost like in Exodus, when there arose a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, you could say there arose a generation that didn't know Moses and Joshua, and they lost sight. They were not the generation that God humbled in the wilderness. Because of that, instead, realize God's blessings. Hold them dear and give thanks. And watch out for the dangers. Resist the dangers of pride and forgetfulness. Remember. As we sing this invitation song this evening, it is our Lord God calling on our hearts to have hearts that bend the knee in humble submission, who give him our worries and cares, provision, who are willing to accept his discipline however it comes, and a people then, having put the Lord on in baptism, who then remember their Lord. Or, to quote the classics, remember who you are. How do you do that? By remembering to whom you belong. As we stand and sing together.